There were 400 people in the Cathedral of the Silver Arch when my fiancée walked in through the main doors, stopped halfway down the aisle, and said, loud enough for every single one of them to hear, "I can't do this. Lucian, I'm sorry, I choose Calum." She said it to me. She was looking at someone else. And in the silence that followed, a silence so total I could hear the candle wax dripping from the chandelier 30 feet above, the summoned hero of the Veilguard Kingdom stepped out from a pew near the back of the cathedral, extended his hand, and my bride-to-be walked to him like she was answering a prayer. That's how it started. At a wedding that never happened, in front of every person who mattered in the kingdom, wearing a formal coat my mother had spent 2 months tailoring because we couldn't afford to commission one. My name is Lucian Ashworth. Yes, same first name as the hero, which became its own particular kind of joke in the weeks that followed. And this is the story of the worst day of my life and everything that grew from its wreckage. But I'm telling it wrong. I keep wanting to start with the altar because that's where the wound is. The truth is, the story doesn't make sense unless you know what came before. So let me back up. Just far enough to explain why Renata Fielding was standing in that aisle in the first place, and why what she did was so much worse than it looked. I grew up in Thornwall, a border town that existed primarily to supply lumber and conscripts to the kingdom's frontier garrison. My family was working class. My father was a carpenter, my mother a seamstress, and my older sister married a farrier when she was 17. But I was the odd one. I tested well enough to earn a merit placement at the Royal Administrative Academy in the capital, which trained the clerks, logisticians, quartermasters, and bureaucrats that kept the kingdom's machinery running. Not glamorous, not heroic, but necessary. And it was a way out of Thornwall that didn't involve carrying a pike on the northern border. I met Renata in my second year. She was a minor noble. Her family held a small fief in the eastern lowlands, wealthy enough for status, but not for real influence. She was vivid. Bright hair, brighter laugh, a way of making you feel like you were the center of something important just by standing near her. She pursued me first. I want to be clear about that. She found me in the records hall, asked me to explain a filing system she didn't understand. And by the third question, I realized she understood it perfectly and was just looking for a reason to talk. We were together for 3 years. I loved her openly and without reservation. She introduced me to her family, who tolerated me in the way minor nobles tolerate useful commoners, politely, with a shelf life. We made plans. I would graduate, take a posting in the capital's trade ministry, and her family would sanction the marriage because an administrative officer in the trade ministry was respectable enough to not embarrass them. The engagement was formalized 6 months before the wedding. I scraped together enough for a modest ring. She wore it every day. I thought that meant something. Then the summoning happened. Calum appeared in the Royal Plaza on a spring morning. Column of light, foreign clothes, the whole spectacle. Young, he handsome, confused, and radiating the goddess's blessing like a bonfire in a dark field. Within a week, the entire capital was restructured around him. Resources redirected, social hierarchies reshuffled. Every noble family began positioning to be close to the hero because proximity to Calum meant proximity to power in the post-war order. Renata was assigned to the hero's administrative support team. Her family pulled strings. It was a prestige appointment, exactly the kind of visibility a minor noble house needed. She worked in the same building as Calum. She attended his briefings, managed his schedule, processed his correspondence. I didn't think much of it. Renata was competent. The posting made sense. And Calum, I'd met him twice, briefly, seemed decent, earnest, a little overwhelmed. Well, it's not the kind of person who would deliberately take someone's fiancé. But the goddess's blessing has a gravity to it. Not mind control, nothing so crude. More like emotional amplification. When Calum paid attention to you, you felt seen in a way that no ordinary person could replicate. When he smiled at you, some part of your brain decided this was the most important moment of your day. It wasn't his fault. He didn't know he was doing it. But it was happening, and Renata spent 8 hours a day in its radius. The changes were gradual. She started working late. She talked about Calum's vision and leadership in ways that sounded rehearsed, like she was quoting something she'd heard at close range and couldn't stop repeating. She wore the ring less often. "It catches on papers," she said. She canceled 2 of our 3 weekly dinners. She looked at me the same way she always had, but there was something behind her eyes that was already somewhere else. I asked her once, directly, "Is something happening with Calum?" She laughed. "Don't be ridiculous, Lucian. He's the hero. I'm a scheduling clerk." She was lying. Not about the facts, She was a scheduling clerk. But about the feeling. Something had shifted inside her, and she was managing it instead of addressing it. And I was too deep in wedding preparations and trade ministry exam reviews to force the conversation. The wedding was set for the 15th of harvest month, 400 guests. The Cathedral of the Silver Arch, which Renata's family had reserved as a statement of ambition. Far too grand for a minor noble's daughter marrying a commoner clerk, but that was the point. They wanted visibility. They wanted the capital to see the Fielding name attached to something beautiful. I found out later, much later, that Calum had told Renata 2 days before the wedding that he had feelings for her. He'd apparently been advised by his senior companions not to say anything, but he'd chosen honesty over strategy. He told her he wouldn't interfere with the wedding, that he respected her choice, and that he just wanted her to know. That was the match. Her choosing to act on it in the middle of the ceremony in front of 400 people with my mother in the second row, that was the fire. I stood at the altar. I watched her walk away. I heard the murmuring start, first confused, then shocked, then shifting to that particular species of social noise that happens when people are witnessing something they'll be talking about for years and they want to make sure they remember every detail. My mother's face. I can't describe it without my throat closing. She looked like someone had reached inside her chest and squeezed. My sister, sitting beside her, had her arm around her and her jaw set in a hard line that meant she was either about to cry or about to hit someone. The officiant cleared his throat. "Lord Ashworth, should we cancel the—" "Obviously," someone said from the front pew. I don't remember turning. I don't remember scanning the room. I remember the voice, though, clear, low, and carrying the specific weight of someone who is used to being heard in large spaces without raising their volume. The woman who stood was seated in the second row on the bride's side, which meant she was a guest of the Fielding family. She was small, slender build, dark hair pinned back simply, wearing a dress so understated it almost disappeared against the cathedral's stone. She had the kind of face that you wouldn't notice in a crowd unless she wanted you to, and she very clearly did not usually want you to. I had never seen her before. She walked to the aisle, not to the altar, to me specifically. She stopped about 3 feet away and looked at me with steady gray eyes and said, in a voice that only I and the officiant and the first 2 rows could hear, "The cathedral is reserved for another 6 hours. The flowers are arranged. The reception is catered. 400 witnesses are seated. And the woman who was supposed to stand here decided that the goddess's chosen hero was a better story than a good man in a well-made coat." She glanced at the empty aisle. "Do you want to waste all of this? Or would you like to do something unforgivable?" I stared at her. "Who are you?" "Elise Trevane." The name didn't register. Not immediately. It took about 4 seconds for the synapses to connect, and when they did, I felt the floor shift under me like the cathedral had just been hit by a siege engine. Trevane. As in the Trevane family. As in the oldest banking house in the kingdom, predating the current royal line by 2 centuries. The family that financed the First Demon War, underwrote the construction of the capital's walls, and held so much quiet economic power that even the King's Council consulted them before major fiscal decisions. Elise Trevane was the sole heiress of that house, and she was standing in front of me at a ruined wedding, offering to take the place of the woman who'd just walked out. "Why?" I said. It was the only word I could form. "Because I came here expecting to watch a minor noble's daughter marry an honest man, and instead I watched her humiliate him in front of everyone he knows. And because I think the cruelest thing a person can do to someone else is turn their most vulnerable moment into a performance." She paused. "And because the catering looked excellent, and I don't want it to go to waste." A laugh escaped me. I didn't plan it. It was the involuntary, half-broken sound of someone whose emotional circuits have been so overloaded that the system starts misfiring. "You want to marry a stranger?" I said. "I want to give you a choice. Right now, in this moment, you can be the man who is left at the altar. That's the story people will tell for the rest of your career. Or you can be the man who was left at the altar and married the Trevane heiress before the candles burned down." She tilted her head. "One of those stories is a tragedy. The other is a legend." The cathedral was silent. 400 people were watching. My mother was watching. The officiant was watching with an expression that suggested he was going to need a very large drink after this. I looked at Elise Trevane. I looked at the empty aisle where Renata had been. I looked at the altar, the flowers, the silver arch that someone had spent 3 days polishing for a wedding that had died 10 minutes ago. I don't even know your favorite color, I said. Gray, she said, like common sense. I extended my hand. She took it, and we walked to the altar together while 400 people held their collective breath and the officiant fumbled for the correct section in his book. We were married in 11 minutes. The reception happened. The food was excellent. My mother spent the first hour in a state of visible confusion, and the second hour in what appeared to be aggressive approval after Elise complimented her tailoring work on my coat and asked detailed questions about stitching techniques. My sister pulled me aside at the dessert course and said, I don't know what just happened, but I think I like her better. That night, yes, Elise and I sat in separate chairs in the suite the Fielding family had reserved for the newlyweds, a suite that neither of us had any emotional connection to, and had the most honest conversation I have ever had with another person. I should tell you why I was really there, she said. She was holding a glass of water, not wine, water. My family has been monitoring the Fielding house's finances for 2 years. They've been overextending, leveraging their fief's revenues against social investments they can't sustain. The wedding was part of that strategy, a spectacle designed to attract attention and signal stability they don't have. So you were scouting. I was observing. My family does that. We watch how people spend money because it tells us who they are. She set the glass down. And then Renata did what she did. And I watched your face, and you didn't scream. You didn't chase her. You didn't collapse. You just stood there, like something inside you had gone very quiet. And I thought, that's either the most broken man in this room or the most steady. And I wanted to find out which. And if I'd been the broken one, then I'd have annulled the marriage tomorrow and you'd have a good story. And since I'm the steady one, she looked at me, directly, without performance. Then I'd like to see what you build. That was Elise. No flattery, no seduction, no emotional manipulation dressed up as vulnerability. She operated on assessment. She watched how people behaved under pressure and drew conclusions from the data. What she'd seen at the altar wasn't romance. It was a stress test, and I'd passed. The marriage was political, initially. Elise was transparent about that. Her family needed a public-facing partner who was competent, stable, and unconnected to the noble factions that constantly maneuvered around the Trevane banking interests. I needed, well, everything. A career path that wasn't destroyed by the altar humiliation. A name that wasn't synonymous with the man who got left for the hero. A foundation to build from. We gave each other what we needed, and we did it without pretending it was more than it was. She helped me secure a position in the kingdom's infrastructure bureau, not through nepotism, but by putting my credentials in front of the right people and letting my work speak. And I helped her family navigate the post-war economic restructuring by applying the logistical analysis skills I'd learned at the academy to trade flow projections that the Trevane analysts had been modeling too conservatively. We worked well together. That was the first surprise. The second surprise was that working well together, consistently, without drama or performance, turned out to be the foundation of something I hadn't expected to feel again. It wasn't a thunderbolt. It wasn't the kind of love that Renata had represented. Bright, consuming, all-encompassing. It was quieter than that. It was the realization, about 4 months in, that I looked forward to coming home. That our evening conversations about fiscal policy, about supply chain bottlenecks, not about the structural integrity of the new harbor expansion, were the most intellectually stimulating hours of my day. That when Elise said good work after reviewing a report I'd drafted, the 2 words carried more weight than any grand declaration because she didn't say things she didn't mean. She was not warm in the way people expect warmth. She didn't perform affection. She showed it through precision, remembering that I liked my tea at a specific temperature, adjusting her schedule to align with mine on days she knew were stressful, once canceling a meeting with a provincial governor because I mentioned offhandedly that I hadn't slept well. The governor can wait, she said. You look like a man who needs soup and silence. She brought both. The love, and it was love, by then, grew from the ground up, not from passion down. It was the kind of love that gets built by 2 people who respect each other's competence, share each other's silences comfortably, and never once make the other person feel like they need to perform worthiness to deserve the relationship. After Renata, that was everything. Now let me tell you what was happening on the other side. Calem and Renata became the kingdom's most visible couple almost overnight. The hero and the woman who chose him at the altar. It was a story that wrote itself. The broadsheets loved it. The court loved it. Renata's family, initially humiliated by the broken wedding, pivoted spectacularly and rebranded the whole thing as destiny. Their daughter hadn't abandoned a fiancé. She'd been called by the goddesses chosen. It was romantic. It was ordained. It was perfect publicity. For about 6 months. The problem was structural. Calem was the hero. His life was the campaign, the war effort, the front lines. Renata had attached herself to a man whose existence was defined by constant movement, constant danger, and a circle of companions who viewed her as an outsider who'd arrived through spectacle rather than merit. She wasn't a fighter. She wasn't a mage. She wasn't a strategist. She was an administrative clerk who'd traded a stable marriage for a front-row seat to someone else's legend. And the seat didn't come with a role. She managed Calem's schedule. She attended briefings. She stood beside him at ceremonies. But when the campaign moved forward, into dangerous territory, into battle planning, into the grinding reality of a war that didn't care about love stories, she was left behind, again and again. Waiting in the capital for a hero who was becoming less a man and more a symbol with every passing month. Meanwhile, the goddess's blessing did what it always did. It radiated outward. Calem's attention, the same golden amplified attention that had drawn Renata in, was now distributed across an entire army, an entire court, an entire kingdom of people who needed to feel that the hero was fighting for them specifically. Renata went from being the center of that attention to being one of hundreds. The feeling that had made her walk down a church aisle and throw away a 3-year relationship was now ambient noise. And there was nothing to replace it with because she'd never built anything with Calem that existed outside the blessing's glow. I heard about this secondhand, mostly from Elise, and whose family's information network was better than the kingdom's intelligence service. She told me these things not to gloat. Elise didn't gloat. She found it inefficient, but because she believed in complete information as a matter of principle. Renata Fielding requested a meeting with the hero's chief of staff last week. She told me one evening over dinner. She wanted to formalize her role in his inner circle. The request was denied. Why? Because she doesn't have one. She's a ceremonial attachment. The campaign doesn't need a scheduling clerk, and the hero's companions don't want a political liability. Elise cut a piece of roasted pheasant with surgical precision. She attached herself to a comet and is now discovering that comets don't slow down for passengers. Calem, to his credit, didn't abandon Renata. He was kind to her. He was kind to everyone. That was the problem and the tragedy of his nature. But kindness distributed equally across thousands of people is indistinguishable from indifference when you're the one person who gave up everything to receive it. The war ended. Calem defeated the demon lord. The kingdom celebrated. Statues went up. Songs were written. And in the restructuring that followed, Calem was offered the hand of the crown princess, a political union that the entire kingdom supported, including the king, the council, and Calem himself, who understood that the hero's role required a partner of state, not a partner of impulse. Renata was set aside, not cruelly, gently, with a generous stipend and a letter of gratitude and the particular politeness that powerful institutions use when they're cleaning up a story they no longer need. She went home to the eastern lowlands. Her family's finances, strained by years of overextension, had not improved. The visibility strategy had failed. The Fielding name was now associated not with destiny, but with the woman who bet everything on the hero and was quietly discarded when the story moved on. The first letter arrived 8 months after the war ended. It was addressed to me, handwritten, Renata's script. I recognized it instantly. She wrote that she'd been reflecting, that she understood now what she'd done at the altar, while that she'd been overwhelmed by forces she didn't fully understand. A reference to the blessing's influence that was probably accurate and was definitely too late. She said she missed what we had. She asked if we could talk. Elise was reading a trade report at the other end of the table when I opened it. She watched me read. She didn't ask what it said. She waited. "It's from Renata," I said. I assumed. Her family's courier arrived this morning. I recognized the livery. She wants to reconnect. Elise set down her report. She looked at me with those steady gray eyes, the same eyes that had assessed me at a ruined altar and decided I was worth a wager. "What do you want to do?" "I want to write back." Something flickered across her face. If I hadn't been watching carefully, well, I would have missed it. A micro-expression of fear so brief it was almost theoretical. Elise Trevane, the woman who canceled meetings with governors and stared down banking cartels, was afraid. For one fraction of a second, she was afraid I'd go back. What I want to write, I continued, is this. I hope you find peace. The marriage I have now is not what I expected, and it is better than anything I could have planned. This correspondence is the last. The fear vanished. In its place was something I'd only seen a handful of times. Elise Trevane, genuinely surprised. You don't want to hear her out? I heard her out for 3 years. She told me I was her choice, and then she walked down an aisle and chose someone else in front of my mother. Whatever she's feeling now isn't about me. It's about the fact that the thing she chose instead didn't work out, and I'm the closest thing to stable ground she remembers. Elise was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's the most emotionally articulate thing you've ever said. I've been practicing. Clearly. She picked up her report, then set it back down. Lucian. Yes? I'm glad you stayed. It was, by Elise Trevane's standards, a declaration of staggering emotional vulnerability. 3 words, no flourish, maximum impact. I'm glad you asked, I said. She nodded once, picked up her report, went back to reading, and I sat across from her at a table in a house that we'd chosen together, in a life that we'd built through work and honesty and the strange, unglamorous miracle of 2 people who started as strangers and became essential to each other through the simple act of showing up every day. 2 more letters came over the following months. I didn't open them, not out of cruelty, out of completion. The conversation was finished. Opening them would have been a service to Renata's need for closure, not mine. I had my closure. It was sitting across the table, reading fiscal projections and occasionally glancing up to ask if I wanted more tea. The broadsheets eventually caught the story. The altar bride returns, that kind of thing. Gossip columns speculated about whether I'd take Renata back. Social commentators debated whether the goddess's blessing constituted a mitigating factor. A few minor nobles tried to broker a meeting, framing it as reconciliation for the good of both houses. Why, Elise handled all of it, not by making statements or engaging with the press, by doing nothing. The Trevane family's silence was its own kind of power. They didn't respond to gossip. They didn't dignify speculation. They simply continued operating with the quiet, immovable authority of a family that had been shaping the kingdom's economy since before the current castle was built. And slowly, inevitably, the story that people told about me changed. I wasn't the man who got left at the altar anymore. I was the man who married the Trevane heiress, the man who restructured the harbor expansion supply chain and saved the Bureau 3,000 gold crowns. The man who showed up to work every morning, produced results, went home to a wife who was arguably the most influential woman in the kingdom, and never once made a spectacle of himself. The altar story became a footnote, then an anecdote, then a legend, but not the kind Renata had imagined. The legend wasn't the woman who chose the hero. It was the man the hero's woman left, who married better before the candles burned out. I didn't build that narrative. I didn't engineer it. I just lived, and the story wrote itself around the living. It's been 3 years now. My mother visits every season. She and Elise have developed a relationship based entirely on textile discussions and mutual respect that I find both heartwarming and slightly terrifying. My sister's husband shoes horses for the Trevane estate stables, which is either nepotism or efficient resource allocation, depending on which Trevane you ask. My work at the Infrastructure Bureau has expanded into a directorship. Elise runs the family's banking operations with the same precision she brings to everything. And, on the evenings when we're both home early, we sit across from each other at the table and talk about numbers and policy and the particular satisfaction of systems that work because someone designed them to. It is not a love story the broadsheets would write. There are no dramatic declarations, no grand gestures, no moments of passion so intense they could sustain a ballad. What there is, instead, is this. A woman who looked at me on the worst day of my life and decided I was worth something. Not because of how I made her feel, but because of how I held myself when everything fell apart. And a man who learned, through the specific pain of being abandoned for something brighter, that the steadiest light in the room is the one you almost don't notice, until it's the only one still burning when everything else goes out. Renata chose the bonfire. She got the spectacle. She got the hero. She got the legend. I got the woman who doesn't need a legend, who builds quietly, who loves precisely, who walked into a cathedral full of humiliation and offered me a future with the same calm she uses to restructure international loan agreements. I got a lease, and I would choose her again, at every altar, in every life, before the candles burn down and long, long after everyone else has gone home.